I had driven down Hooch Road probably a dozen times and never noticed it on my right. It was a small white farmhouse that stood on the side of an old highway that ran through Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. This road had several sections, including the old Cataloochee Turnpike, but in the days of my grandfather's youth it was simply the Hooch Road, a winding dirt road through the Carolina mountains that served as the basis for today's NASCAR culture, moonshiners. The house was neat, freshly whitewashed, straight as a pin, with a board fence enclosing the pasture on the side. A patched radiator hose and steam billowing out from under the hood of my truck. I knew I didn't have much time left on this stretch of road, so I pulled into a gravel lot and parked halfway to the house. "Hey, anybody home?" I called out, knocking on the wooden door. Highlanders can be a bit peculiar with strangers, but once they get to know you better, you can't find a better group of people. Nevertheless, just in case, I kept my distance on the porch. After a few moments, a face hidden from view by an upstairs window answered. "Yes. Who are you and what do you want?" A woman's voice answered. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Joshua Sutton from Waynesville, and I was hoping I could fix my truck and get some water from you. I had a burst radiator hose, which I fixed quickly a few miles ago, but it won't take me any farther down the road." "Wait here," she told me, and disappeared out the window. I looked around and noticed how clean and neat everything was. All the screens were in good condition, the porch was freshly painted, and there was a garden on the side. When I turned to the door, two large German Shepherd dogs stood in the opening, silent and obedient to their master. "As long as you are well behaved, the dogs will leave you alone," the woman said, and opened the door in front of me. "Come on in. Do you need anything to drink?" "Yes, please. A glass of water, ma'am." "Are you related to the Suttons from Sandy Hollow? There's a whole clan of them in Zacky Hollow." She looked at me. "No, ma'am. At least not that I know of. My father's family has been in Waynesville for generations, and no one has ever talked about relatives in Sandy Hollow, but I guess you never know." She brought me a glass of water and offered me a seat while the dogs squatted and watched my every move. The cool, icy water quenched my dusty thirst, and the breeze from the fan dried my sweat-soaked shirt. "My name is Sandra Dresser, and that couple over there is Samson and Delilah." The two dogs continued to sit with their tongues sticking out of the corners of their mouths. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Sandra. I was hoping you had some materials I could use to make a short, flexible tube, something like rubber. I noticed a collection of old cars over there in the pasture." "Oh, heck! You can have whatever you need if it will do you any good." "I appreciate that, Sandra," I replied, and got up from the table slowly so as not to scare the dogs away. It didn't help, and both dogs got on all fours before Sandra uttered the "sit" command. They both went back to squatting. She walked out the door with me and the two dogs, and I admired her attractive figure as she walked across the porch. I estimated her to be in her early 30s, and her long dark hair was gathered in a ponytail and tucked into a cap. Her look was complete with work boots, skinny jeans, and an old t-shirt, and a pair of bright blue eyes. Taking tools from my truck, we walked across the pasture to a collection of old cars parked behind a dilapidated barn. Digging around, I found some flexible steel and rubber hoses and clamps that allowed me to temporarily fix the car. An hour later, my truck was ready to go. "It's getting close to lunchtime. Why don't you come in and wash up and grab a bite to eat before you hit the road?" she asked with inviting sincerity. I hesitated at first, but I was hungry too, so I agreed. Besides, the delicious smells coming from the kitchen would take me over no matter how much I begged. I wasn't disappointed. Sandra prepared a dish of smoked pork chops, mashed potatoes, collard greens and peas, topped with hot, moist cornbread, followed by bread pudding and hot coffee. "Miss Sandra, that was the best pile of food I've had in years. I'm serious." "It was nothing special." She tried to tone it down, but to no avail. "I don't have many guests here, and I like to cook, so I guess you came just in time." She tossed a couple bites to the two dogs, who kept their eyes on me the entire time I was in the house. In one gulp, everything was eaten, and they continued their mission with long tongues sticking out of their mouths. "About those old cars by your barn, you know there are a few people who could take a couple of them if you wanted to sell them." She looked at me for a moment before turning away. "They belong to my husband, or rather my ex-husband. They've been lying here since the day he left." "Well, I know that one of them, at 65 Fairlane, is worth good money if you decide to part with it. The same goes for the '57 Ford pickup truck, I informed her. It's been gone for 2 years, so I figured I should do something with it. A guy from Knoxville came by a year ago and offered to buy it for almost nothing. He took me for a fool, so I sent him on his way. Remembering that, she smiled, and it lit up the room. I helped her put away the rest of her dinner, and when I was done, I realized that it was time for me to hit the road if I wanted to make it before nightfall. I had only met this woman a few hours ago, but already I could sense a politeness in her that was disposing and appealing. I felt a slight disappointment at having to leave. Miss Sandra, I know someone who would be very interested in this '57 Ford. If you would like to consider selling it, I would be happy to let him know. Let me give you my card, and if you think of it, give me a call. I'd love to come down here. I'd really enjoy it. I think she realized I was hinting at a return visit, but I left it in her hands for now. I had to get back on the road. We shook hands graciously. I started the car and turned back onto Hooch Road. I was driving down Highway 321, which would take me to Pittman Center, and I kept thinking about the pretty woman in the white farmhouse. She told me that her ex left 2 years ago. That's about the same time I got ex status, and not a day goes by that I don't think about how bad it was and how damn good I was back then. Of course, the people who remind me of that are the wrong people. I married my ex-wife 5 years before she left. Unlike Sandra's ex-husband, June Sutton keeps coming back, even though the paperwork has been done for a year and a half. I always thought it was a good 5 years, and June continues to claim that, but a lot of dark water has flowed under the bridge in that time. When I first met her, she was just a 19-year-old waitress at a diner, and I was a 23-year-old handyman with no job who hauled truck parts across 5 counties and 2 states to make a living. At least I was paying all the bills in my corner of the world. June could pay her car payment and still live at home. I asked her out on a date, but she declined as she was apparently dating some guy from Asheville. She didn't realize that she was just a common whore for the drum circle statue and nothing more. By the time I once again stopped by the bar while driving by, their relationship had been put on hold. This time, when I asked her out, she accepted. We had a good time, ate a burger each, and with a 6-pack of beer in the truck, went to the Maggie Valley Fiddlers show and had a great time. It was so good we repeated it a few more times. Anyway, a couple months later I popped the question, and another 3 months later we were married in an outdoor ceremony next to an old country church in Sunburst, North Carolina. A year later we had raised enough money to buy a small white frame house on a couple acres south of town. It didn't have anything special, but it had enough room for a garden and a shed that I could use as a workshop. There were no kids at the time, and June was attending the local community college, still working at the BBQ during the day and a couple evenings during the week. I spent most of the day on the road delivering and taking orders, occasionally stopping overnight in Tennessee. This life continued for the next couple years until June graduated and got a job as a shift nurse at the local county hospital. I was still traveling daily and was promoted to regional manager. The distractions of traveling weren't as much of a problem, but it also paid better. I received a portion of the commission on all sales. Since we were both working full-time now, and June was working shifts, we had to make the most of the time we had together during the week. She usually had to fill in for each other every weekend, and every 12 weeks she switched to night work with 12-hour shifts. The only upside was the pay raise. After a couple years, she was making almost as much as me, and we were able to double the house payments. On weekends, when her shift allowed, we hit a couple of night spots in Asheville, usually with 2 or 3 other couples we knew. A few people from her work started joining us as well, and eventually we formed a weekend hangout of about 12 people who got together in one form or another on a fairly regular basis. One of the places we frequented was a dance hall on Patton Road in Asheville. It was a long bottleneck with lots of people in it, and we all fit in there just fine. We went there in pairs, most of us were married, and no sooner was the night over than I was already dancing with one of the others and June was doing the same. I always thought there was nothing wrong with that. And sometimes people danced with people they knew there or who they went to school with. I did that too, and June did too. Like I said, there was nothing wrong with it. We all went home with the people we came with. But, as with everything, eventually some ferret came along and atomized everything. A few months after we started going to this particular place, I was dancing with one of the girls at our table, a coworker of June's named Terry, who for some reason kept directing us to the other side of the dance floor. I didn't pay much attention to it because I was mostly innocent. When the next number came up, she left me on the floorboard for a slow dance and turned the stove on full blast. We were at the far end of the set from our table. Jesus, Terry, what are you doing? Apparently, nothing you don't already want to do. And I was a young guy dancing with a girl and she smelled great. Sure, the blood was flowing and I'm sure that was the plan, but I was happily married and despite all the opportunities, and there were many, I hadn't cheated and had no intention of doing so. Terry, I'm a one-woman man. If you weren't, I'm sure we'd be at my house as early as next week, but June will take care of that tonight. I smiled, trying not to brush her off. She only smiled back and said, "Oh, I'll have that opportunity someday." We changed the subject and finished the dance, after which I turned her back around to her escort, a guy named Tom. June and a few others were still on the dance floor, and as I looked around the floor, I noticed that she was dancing very close to some guy I had never seen before. He was whispering something in her ear, and she was just smiling and giggling. But then he grabbed her, and she was clearly enjoying it. For a moment, I thought about getting up and dancing, but then I remembered about Terry. In hindsight, I should have intervened, but that was all in the past now. Someone ordered another round of drinks and June returned to the table with her new dance partner. I feigned ignorance when she introduced him as Charlie, an old friend from high school days, until his family moved to Asheville. I didn't like him from the start, though perhaps where his hand used to be played a part in that. Maybe it was his cocky smirk as he looked at me with his hand on my wife's shoulder. But when June saw my reaction to him, she cooled down a bit and took her hand away. He lingered for a few moments and then moved on, giving June a quick peck on the cheek and shaking my hand. I felt like crushing the little creep, but I kept my decorum. And on the way back to the house, the conversation was expected. "Do you let every man run his hand over your ass when you dance with him, June?" "No more than if you let a girl stroke you," she replied. That caught me off guard. Terry deftly moved us to the far end of the room. At that moment, it didn't occur to me to look to see where June was. "I didn't ask her to do that, and she said no right away," I replied. "Well, so did I, big boy. Do you get jealous every time a man thinks he has a chance at impossibility?" She grinned as she said this and diffused the tension. "Charlie has about as much chance of getting me into bed as Terry does. I mean, none." She was right. We had both hit the bullseye, and we needed to stop playing this game. We did that the same night we got home, and after a good warm-up, I hit the bullseye. For the next few months, things were good. We got together regularly, sharing driving duties. One Saturday night, I was one of those assigned to the sufferers, and the women in our group outnumbered the men 2-1. 4 guys were in the National Guard that weekend and couldn't make it. June and a few of the girls were drinking tequila and walking confidently toward their goal. The problem with June and tequila is a common one. She loses all her inhibitions. In other words, she's not going to be easy to deal with. I tried my best to keep up with her and dance as much as I could, but the dance card was filling up with other girls who were performing alone that night, including June's friend Terry. Having to keep an eye on June and the others and fend off Terry's brazen seduction. "She went outside with the other girls to get some air, Josh. She's in good hands," Terry whispered in my ear. Nevertheless, when the dance was over, I returned to the patio where the smokers were getting rid of their habits and puffing themselves silly. June and her friends continued to laugh merrily, so I left them alone and returned to the table. Most of the party was on the floor, so I hooked up with Terry and another girl they were working with. They were both heavily intoxicated, and the other girl was just plain drunk off her ass. "So, Josh, June told us you have big," the tipsy girl said. All I could do was laugh out loud. She mouthed each word inaudibly, and all I could see on Terry's face was a goofy grin. Then she carelessly said something that quickly brought everything back to normal. I was the only sober one at the table. Drunks think everything around them is funny as hell and, God knows, don't know when to shut up. "It's not fair that she has 2 and we have none." They both thought it was funny as hell and giggled until Terry realized the significance of what was being said. I realized what was said by the way the words came out of the little shit's mouth. I ignored Terry. "Who else has one that big?" I asked. "Charlie's. Oops. I wasn't supposed to say that, was I?" She muttered, struggling to get the words out after Terry threw her an angry look. I think Terry, even in her drunken state, understood the implications of what was said at the table. I got up to go to the men's room while Terry tried to intervene. Not now, Terry, I said firmly. Now those comments could have meant something very different from what I thought they meant, and I didn't know. The two drunk women were giggling at the fact that my wife had two men, me and someone named Charlie. It could have meant that she had fun with him before we got together, or that she had fun with him since we had been together, or that she was having fun with him now. Of course, it could have just been the ramblings of a drunken drunk. It was getting close to closing time and I needed to help corral the girls. So I gathered the drunken company on the patio, not missing the gathering of horny young men who had decided that the choice was ripe. The two of us designated drivers loaded everyone into two cars and hit the road. By the time June and I reached home, it was 2 in the morning and I had to carry her like a sack to bed. I sipped my beer and sat outside thinking about the plan. If she was doing something one-off, I might have put up with it, but this wasn't a one-off. Far from a one-off. The funny thing is, I know she loves me, so I could get over it if she drank too much or something and didn't do it again. But if it was the same Charlie from a few months ago, it wasn't the slightest mistake. For a while, I stayed overnight at her place on Tuesdays and Wednesdays every week. Tuesdays were June's day off, so if she was having fun with someone, there was little chance of being caught. Sometimes cruel fate does as it pleases. Such was the case with my marriage. The following Tuesday night, I drove back to Waynesville instead of staying in Sevierville, Tennessee. I grabbed a bag of BBQ and a few drinks and settled in to watch the game from the upper field across the street from our house. When I arrived, it was already 11 p.m. and June's car was gone. I called her in the evening, as usual, and let her know I would be back late that night. She had planned to stay home, watch TV, and maybe call her sister or someone else before going to bed. Apparently, she ran to the payphone to do that. So I just sat back, leaned back in my seat, rolled down the window, turned on the radio to the ball game, and turned off the interior lights. Around 12:30, 2 sets of headlights drove down the road on the Waynesville side, slowed down, and turned into the yard. June's car stayed in its usual spot and the other parked right behind it. I didn't have to guess who Charlie's nemesis was on the dance floor. That damn shoeshine man even had the nerve to wear a cowboy hat. Everything happened as usual. The bedroom light came on, followed by the soft glow of the nightlights we'd placed by the bed. I was tempted to go home, but it wasn't time yet. I sat there, angry at her, at the world. And if I had criminal intentions, I would have shot the bastard. But I know what prison is like, even if it's just the local county jail. I sat there until 2 in the morning when the lights came back on, and a few minutes later her lover came out of the front door, turned around, kissed her, shook his fist at her, and went to his car while June scolded him to be quiet. Like I said, if I'd been a murderer, Charlie would be rotting on worm food right now. Instead, I started the car and, headlights off, pulled onto the road and headed back to Waynesville. Over the next 2 weeks, I repeated these attempts with the same results, and the following week I decided it was time to call it a day. This time, they got home a little early, and when the bedroom light came on, I crossed the road, stopped at his car, and flattened all 4 tires and one of June's tires. I didn't need the money from the account beyond what was necessary. By the time I got to the back of the house, the nightlights were on and the bedroom window was up to circulate cool air in the house. I entered the house through the back door, and after turning on the video on my phone, I slowly walked back to the bedroom. I turned on the lights and the surprised expressions on their faces were priceless. "It looks a hell of a lot like trying to do the unthinkable to me," I told them both. He was fumbling around, not realizing what was going on. June was just in shock at being discovered and was crying hard. I tapped the S&W pistol in the clip on my belt and ordered him to get out of here. He grabbed his clothes and rushed past me, saving what he thought was his life. I heard the door close behind him and turned to June just as he screamed, "Jesus, my car!" He discovered flat tires. Whatever or wherever he was going, he wasn't going back to the house. "Josh, please let me explain. I know there's a book of explanations for every asshole in this situation, but when they get to the last page, the words, 'oh shit,' are there." "June, shut the hell up and listen to me. Tell me how long. I only need one number. Tell me how many times you've had fun with this asshole." "Josh, please listen to me," she cried. "One number. How many times? How many goddamn times? I'll ask you again if it doesn't fit in your stupid head." "Just once, I swear," she cried again. "Jesus, what a damn relief," I said, leaving the bedroom and heading into the kitchen for a cold beer. The land shark bottomed out smoothly, and I stood there looking at her, wrapped in an old pink bathrobe. I finished my beer and opened another before heading outside. Peckerwood was nowhere to be seen, and the moonlight reflected off the hood of his car with four flat tires. I grinned to myself, proud of my manly stance. I'd already cried it all out a couple weeks ago. Now all that was left was to get down to business. I backed my truck out of the field across the street and parked it behind the house before thinking of another option. I had a hard hitch for hauling cargo in the shed, so I strapped the bastard's car to the hitch and set off on the 5-mile trek to Waynesville. About a mile and a half later, I passed him with the car on all four wheels on the rims behind me. Upon reaching Waynesville, near the Salvation Army store, I left his car in the parking lot and headed home. June was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. "Joshua, can we talk about this, please?" I looked at her and simply said, "Not today," and took the remaining 6 bottles and went into my store. It's a man cave for mechanics, and I've set up a pretty decent lounge area in the attic. To the soundtrack of Mars Hotel, I finished the rest of my beer and fell asleep. The next day, I called to let my boss know that I was having problems on the home front and was heading over to the house to deal with the slut. "June, you need to move out and stay with your sister. You're the one who messed this up." Surprisingly, she didn't argue. Maybe, she thought, it helped that she'd said it was just a one-time thing. After the two of them changed the flat tire, her sister came over and helped load a bunch of stuff into both cars. Before they left, the sister, Anne, came out to the store to talk to me. I had always liked her, and I didn't hold a grudge against her for being related. "Josh, are you going to take her back? Did you know she was having fun with me?" Anne shook her head and brushed away a tear. "You two have always been very good together. I really hate to see that happen." "Me neither, sister. Me neither." I hugged her, and the two of them drove down the road. The next day, I filed the divorce papers and all hell broke loose. It started with June, then her parents, then her parents, then her parents, then her parents, her friends, my siblings, and so on and so forth. Everyone thought we could work things out and everything would be fine. It was all a one-time mistake. "June, tell everyone the truth or I'll send out videos and pictures from previous dates to everyone you damn well know." I think she went into shock at the revelation that I knew about the previous dates. Nevertheless, she said something to them because the excuses had changed. Now it was the "young people make mistakes all the time" excuse, and that we were young and could work things out, maybe have a kid or two. It was constant, incessant. Eventually, I stopped taking calls unless they were work-related. I told June to take whatever she needed from the house when I was at work. I was going to keep the house and buy out her share. There would be no alimony, and everything we had we were putting into the house, except for the small pension we each got from work. Basically, it was simple. It was so simple that 6 months later we were officially divorced, although the trying and pleading to be together again never stopped. June would often drop by the restaurant and come over to my booth or the bar where I was sitting. Her sister Anne would stop by 2 or 3 times a week just to talk and feed me. For a while I thought she had decided to try it on her own, but that wasn't the case. I finally decided to resort to an innovative way to end it all. I called Terry and asked if she wanted to go to the dance hall on Patton on Friday night. She agreed and ended up spending the entire weekend at my house and in my bed. I underestimated this woman. She completely exhausted me and left me with a smile on my face all week. Of course, one of the reasons I chose Terry, among other things, was that I knew she wouldn't be able to keep her mouth shut to save her life. You could be sure she was reporting step by step on everything we were doing just to score points with her working clique, which, as far as I knew, still included June. It worked out better than I expected. The next weekend came, and Friday night I went to the dance hall alone. June had apparently switched to day shifts because she was there with several members of the old clique, and lo and behold, there she was with Charlie. I've never understood how women think. I guess it's an occupational hazard of being a man. June, her sister, her parents, and everyone else I could remember, except for a few horny women with other agendas, had been devising ways to convince me to somehow get her back. And here she was, with an old nemesis. I took a seat at the bar and sipped a cold beer, watching the couples on the floor. Soon, June and Charlie slipped out there and performed a lewd act for someone else, I guessed for me. When they were done, Peckerwood went back to his table and June walked over to the bar. It doesn't have to be that way, Josh. What do you mean? We're not together or with other people. I'm alone here, I said, looking around defiantly. June's throat flushed slightly. I had realized early on in our marriage that this was a sign that she was about to explode, so I interrupted her. I leaned over and whispered in her ear. Listen carefully, June. I don't care what that monkey is doing in your house. You've been with him for a long time and you can keep squealing with him. I'm sure you know I had a good time with your friend Terry last weekend. She jerked back and slapped me hard and then burst into tears. Peckerwood got up from the table and headed for the bar, but he had another thought when I raised my hand at him. See that asshole you're with right now? He froze in place when I held out my hand to him. The only thing he's interested in is having a great night and nothing else. That's all he's ever been interested in? And you gave him what belonged to me over and over again. You took away what was special between us and brought that dirty scumbag into our bed, into our lives. So now live with it. I'm moving on. With those words, I finished the rest of my beer and walked out of the house. She ran out after me, crying, but I just started the car and drove off. I ended up at Jack of the Wood, sipping Green Man Ale and watching hippie girls dancing the dervish. I found out later that June had left with her girlfriend right after me, and according to people in the know, she wasn't going out as much as she used to. I didn't go out with Terry again like June said, although I was tempted. She really was that good. Instead, I plunged back into work. June and Anne continued to hit on me every chance they got, although I think Anne realized it was a lost cause. The other thing was her parents and mine. My parents kept inviting June to barbecues even when I wasn't around. She was the daughter they never had for them and they didn't want to let her go. I think we all changed some aspects of our lives as a result of the divorce and its aftermath. For me, it was going back to the woods. Growing up in the Smokies and national forests gave me a sense of belonging, a kind of identity. I wasn't a redneck, whatever that means, and I wasn't a redneck. I guess I was a woodsman at heart. So I changed my habits. When I drove into Tennessee on my route, I used to drive through Murphy or cross the I-40 freeway. Instead, I started taking the old Cataloochee Turnpike or the Hooch Road through the mountains. It was a little longer, but in good weather it was a great ride. And sometimes I could stop and cast a fishing rod into a creek along the way. How I didn't see that neat white cabin on the Tennessee side on all those trips, God only knows, but one day I did. I had just finished cutting the grass, put the mower down, and was sipping a cold beer when my phone rang in my pocket. Joshua, hi, this is Sandra Dresser from Cosby. You stopped by my place last week to get your truck fixed. I remembered. Hell, for the past few days I couldn't get her out of my head. There was something about her that made me feel comfortable, even though I'd only met and talked to her for a few hours. I'd been meaning to call her about that '57 Ford for a long time with some new information. Hello, Miss Sandra. I never forget a gracious hostess. I was going to call you in a day or two about your old Ford. Yes, that's exactly what I was calling about. That and others. You made me think about them again, and I decided to do something about them. I thought maybe you might want to stop by here next time and help me figure out what my next steps should be. There were 11 old cars on this lot, and all of them, as far as I could tell, were in very good condition body and frame-wise. The next steps were simple: appraise them and sell them. She already knew this, so the invitation was personal. I'm going up there next Thursday, but to tell you the truth, I wouldn't mind a ride in the mountains tomorrow, as Sunday promises to be beautiful. I offered this with prayer and hope. 30 minutes later, I was in the chair of a barbershop in Waynesville getting my hair cut, and I picked up a nice Cabernet on the way home. I'm mostly a beer drinker, but I can tell a good red wine from a bad one. At 9 the next morning, I set off down the familiar road on a beautiful day. There were fishermen working on both sides of the bridge as I crossed Big Creek, and if I hadn't had a date on the way, I would have stopped longer. Just as I pulled up to this spot, one kid was pulling out a nice 1-pound trout that he caught on what looked like a version of a fly. I stopped where I left off and headed back down the road. When I pulled up to Miss Sandra's house, she was standing at the front door talking animatedly with some man, and her 2 dogs were squatting and watching her every move. Another man sat in another car and watched all this while I parked the car and walked down the driveway. The conversation between them grew louder as I got within a few feet of them. Bill told me I could get that 65 in exchange for some work I did for him a couple months ago, for crying out loud, the man said to Sandra. Well, I don't know anything about that, and from what I understand, Bill ended things here over 2 years ago, so if he owes you anything, you'll have to deal with him, not me. Wait a minute, he started to answer before I intervened. Good morning, Miss Sandra. Is everything okay in here? She looked at me with a hint of apprehension on her face before answering. Everything is fine, Joshua. That gentleman was just leaving. And I know. The man looked at me and I could see the anger in his eyes, but I just smiled and wished him a good day. We watched as he climbed back into his truck and pulled out onto the road, heading back to Cosby. So what was that all about? I asked. I think my ex-husband is causing me problems. He can't drive onto the property. What's more, he can't even drive down the driveway in front of the house because he has a restraining order against him. I grinned to myself and said, how convenient. Oh, before I forget, I brought a bottle of wine, a 12 St. Francis Cabernet, if you'd like to put it in the fridge for a bit. She smiled graciously and we returned to the porch with dogs in tow. After the wine was put away, we settled on the porch and talked about the inventory of old cars by the barn. Along with a 57 Ford and a 65 Fairlane, there was a 67 Barracuda, a 69 Olds 442, and a 48 Caddy, along with a half-dozen other unremarkable sedans. It wasn't a bad deposit if she got a fair price for them. Right? I know someone who would pay a pretty decent price for that 57. In the condition it's in now, I think you could get at least $8,000, maybe $10,000 if it's still strong, I told her. Tell them I'm interested, she replied. We chatted some more about this and that, and I arranged to talk to an acquaintance in Sevierville who did a lot of this sort of thing. I thought he might be willing to sell them on commission to ensure a fair price. When everything was settled, I was treated to a culinary treat, fried chicken with all the condiments. After everything was cleaned up and put away, we took a walk through the pasture and into the mountain forest behind her house. It's a beautiful area, a combination of farmland and mountains, and there's so much greenery you won't find anywhere else on God's earth. At one point, we stopped along a small, babbling brook and stopped to look around. So, Josh, what's your story? Married, single, in a relationship, divorced? Know where you've been and where you're going? Damn, I didn't know what to say, so I told her the truth, at least the simplified version of it. I told her about how I'd caught June with a male dog and how it had ruined our marriage. She learned about how she, her sister, her parents, my parents, and all of our friends had tried to get me to go back to her. I even told her about dating Terry, just to piss June off and make her realize that I was trying to move on with my life. I told her that I went on dates from time to time, but nothing serious. Sandra just smiled as if she was going through the same thing I was, and it turned out that to some extent she was. Josh, okay, I'll tell you mine. I got married right out of high school. Biggest mistake of my life. If I thought at the time that life was going to be great for a few years and then turn to shit almost overnight, I would have bought the first bus ticket out of that void. Anyway, we had a few good years before everything went to shit, and I think that's very similar to your experience, although my baker was delusional. She burst out laughing. That's the funniest thing you can call baker would. Bill Dresser, did you ever know him? He lives on the south side of Hazelwood, in Balsam, not far from where you are now. I shook my head. No. Well, I think he was, as my father used to say, in love with a girl from Cosby who turned out not to be as interesting as he thought. I think they had something a couple times. She didn't know he was married, and when she found out I was his wife, she dumped him like a hot potato. Jesus, that's funny. She came here one day while Bill was at work and confessed everything, apologizing to me the whole time. We'd known each other since high school, but we'd never revolved in the same circles. Apparently, Bill didn't take no for an answer. The girl went to Texas to stay with her father in no small part because of Bill's constant harassment. That asshole, I like that term, went to Texas to stalk her. She called and told me about it, and that's when I put all his stuff out on the porch and called him to come and get it before it rained on them. He came back 2 days later, broke into the house when I wasn't there, made a mess, and took his junk back into the house. When I got home that night with Samson and Delilah, I put him in the corner with both dogs while I cleaned up all his crap on the lawn. My dogs know who Mommy is, really, kids. She ruffled the fur and collar of both dogs, who sat at her feet, sticking their tongues out again and watching me. The next day, Dad and I went to the lawyer's office and got a restraining order against him. And a couple days later, he was taken to work. The next week, he was back in Texas again and harassing the poor girl. I still talk to her sometimes. Nice guy, but she's smart enough to tell him where to cut loose. For all I know, he's living in some woman's trailer in Silva. If Sandra was hurt from the experience, she didn't show it, displaying a huge smile on her face. Kicking that bastard out is the best thing I've ever done, she said after some thought. We talked some more after that, and I found out that Sandra had settled down quite well after the divorce. She worked as a midwife in eastern Tennessee, mostly in the foothills. The farm she lived on, she had inherited from her grandmother years ago and had grown tobacco on a small 3-acre plot before the divorce. After she left, there was no one to care for it. Back at the house, I took a close look at the old cars by the barn and took pictures to show my friend. Since it was late and I had to go to work in the morning, we parted with a very pleasant hug, and she broke the embrace with a long kiss on the cheek. I'll probably drop in on you tonight this week, maybe Thursday, if I hear back from my friend in Sevierville. If I won't be there, I'll be very glad, Mr. Josh Sutton. I'll call you to let you know. She smiled. That late Sunday afternoon, I went to Hatch Road again, like a kid who first fell in love in the schoolyard. It was a sort of half-date. Not quite a date, but something other than just socializing. For me, Thursday couldn't come fast enough. On Tuesdays, barbecue joint offered fried catfish with all the trimmings for $9.99 plus drinks. It's thin fried strips of fish, coleslaw, beans, potato salad, and Carolina hush puppies, which are considered the best in the state. June and I have been there often, but this evening I came alone and took a vacant booth to read the newspaper while we ate. Before I could even begin my meal, they walked in, spotted me, and all three of them slipped into my stall. "Look, it's the lanky traveler," Dad said to me as he slipped into his part of the stall. Mom and June sat down across from me. I'd be lying if I said June looked bad. She looked better than good, and she knew I knew it too. "I assume you guys just happen to be here when I'm sitting like this?" I asked them, no one in particular. "We come every Tuesday, Josh. You know that," Mom said. June just smiled and turned on the twinkle toggle switch for her eyes. On top of sitting all taut, it made her look even better. "That's right, catfish on Tuesday and brisket on Thursday. The best in all the Carolinas right here." Dad picked up on it. Okay, I was cornered and I knew it, so we all filled our plates at the front desk and sat down to eat. I think there was a contest to see who could eat the most. I was competing to see who could eat the most. For me, it was probably the most awkward meal I'd had in a long time, but for the three of them, it was just like old times. "Isn't this great? I remember when the four of us used to gather here every week," Mom said with a wide smile on her face. June brightened up immediately. I had to go to the bathroom. When I came back, Dad started to get up to let me back in, but I gently put my hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to, Dad. I've got an early morning and I need to spend the night. I'll stop by Hickory's first thing." I tossed the 20 on the table, smiled, wishing everyone a great night, even June, and headed for the exit with a satisfied grin on my face. It was only 6:30 in the evening. 30 minutes later, I was already at Bujum Tarum with a pint of cold beer. The beer hall had always been a favorite hangout, but until recently it hadn't had any live entertainment, unless you counted the village drunks who wandered in by mistake as such. A couple months ago, Ben and Kelsey, the owners of the place, had added a live band and plenty of room to party on Saturday nights. It wasn't June and her companion's favorite place, so I started coming here regularly. Besides, it was a great place to pick up a friendly girl with similar inclinations. That night, Ben was working the bar and pouring me my usual double IPA while I admired the scenery. A few of the girls were playing pool, and the guys were, as usual, sipping an early evening pint and watching the game on the screen above the bar. "Long time no see, stranger. How's it going?" she asked over her shoulder, taking a seat next to me. She looked damn good as usual, but Terry always looked good. Damn good and perfect for a slow evening like this. I hadn't gone out with her since that very first time I wanted to encourage June to move on with her life. Obviously, it hadn't worked. "Well, Terry, I'm doing great, and you look like life is treating you well, too." I praised her sincerely. "I think I'm doing well. Things have been slow lately, but having you here gives a girl hope." At those words, she patted my thigh. I bought her a beer and we sat at a table in the corner next to the girls playing pool. We chatted about what was going on and I learned that the old clique still got together occasionally on weekends. And even June joined in the celebrations. I didn't bother asking around, and Terry didn't bother to clarify who her ex was currently partying with. It was none of my business, but the longer I sat with her, the more I realized who I wanted to spend the evening with. After a couple hours, we cut to the chase and fell asleep. She didn't have to go to work that morning, so I let her roll around in bed and hang out at my house. He said, Josh, I know you and I aren't going to become a couple or anything, but I'd like to have a casual relationship every now and then. Is that okay with you? After the previous evening and morning's awakening, I was sure it was a good idea. I don't mind, but only if neither of us are in a serious relationship. That same day, Sandra called to say she would be home Thursday afternoon and evening, unless she was called away for an unexpected delivery. That call really brightened my day. I contacted a friend of mine in Sevierville, and after looking at his email, I realized that Sandra would pull off a good score if she accepted his offer. When I got home that night, all hell was breaking loose at Joshua Sutton's house. Terry had been home since morning, as I'd expected, and around lunchtime, June and my mother had dropped by on some pretext. It wasn't the first time she'd done this. She'd make up a whole list of excuses, or my mother might have stopped by on some business. It didn't matter if I was there or not. It was pretty clear what Terry was there for, or at least when I was there. June was confused. I guess she just wasn't ready for another woman in the house that used to be her home, and the two of them had hit it off while my mom tried to intervene. Other than a few strands of hair and smeared makeup, no one was particularly hurt. Someone knocked over a potted plant, but that was pretty much all the physical damage. About a half hour after I got home, they drove into the yard, Mom, Dad, and June. I don't know what they were going to do, but I cracked my neck and waited for them to come in. Mom started first. Joshua, I don't know what kind of house you have, but having vagrants running through it at all hours of the day and night is wrong. Dad just sat there and kept quiet because he knew better. I looked questioningly at June and then at Mom. Okay then, how old am I, Mom? 30. And how long have I been living on my own? Since you turned 19, I think. That's right, since I was 19. And I've lived in this house since I was 24, right? She nodded in agreement. And I'm a married man now, Mom? Well, you were and should be. I interrupted her at that. I was, that's true, but now I'm not. Do you see how it works? Now the next question. Who are these tramps you're talking about, Mom? I ask because as far as I know, there is only one tramp living in this house, and I caught her with her tramp legs spread wide and another man buried deep inside her. So who are these tramps running around my house? I'd like to know. Mom and June sat on the couch stunned and couldn't say anything. Dad started to mumble something about not talking to Mom like that, but stopped before he buried himself too deep in shit. So I continued. Let me be honest about a few things. I pretty much own the place, and as a 30-year-old adult who isn't married to anyone or a monk or anything like that, I like a little fun company every now and then. You can always take me with you. June cried big tears. I just laughed and took another sip. I had you, and look how that turned out. Okay, here's how it's gonna be. I don't want someone coming into my house in the middle of the day when I'm not here. I didn't make a big deal about it before, but now I'm telling you all. I'll change the locks if I can't trust you. One more thing. If I have any guests you don't like, don't come. Come back another time and we'll grill a burger or something. But if there's a hottie in my single man's house, what do you think will happen when Mom and Dad try to throw a party, huh? I grinned, looking at the three of them. Any of you want to have a beer or something? You too, June. Nah. Mom and Dad found something to drink and pulled a cold chicken out of the fridge. I took June to my workshop. Look, I'm going to go by the book. You have no reason to come to my house and bitch about the company I keep or anything else going on in my life, June. None. You're having fun with someone right now, I know. I've never understood that. Why do you think it's okay if some guy is entertaining you, but get into a fight if Susie Q, Jill on the Hill, and yes, even Terry get the love you spewed out on that creep Charlie? You did this to us, June, not me. I have no idea who you're giving yourself to now, and frankly, I don't care. I don't care. So it boils down to this. You need to start being civil and get on with your life and stop trying to trip me up with my own parents. I know they love you and you love them. I realize that. But I want you to get off Terry's back. She hasn't done anything to you, and I haven't done anything to you for that matter. She lowered her eyes to the ground, and when she looked up at me, I saw pain in them. I knew she still loved me, but despite that, she continued to cheat on me even as she tried to supposedly win me back. We got back to the house and Mom and Dad were reclining in a chair watching some old TV show. By the time they all left, I was done, aside from Terry's phone call. I needed to apologize for the family commotion. The next day, during lunch at the local diner, June Ann's sister sat down in the booth across from me. Hi, Josh. You're looking good, as always. As I've noted before, I've always liked Anne and appreciated her kindness. I was talking to June this morning and she told me about this episode, as she put it yesterday. I think she understands, Josh. She really does. I hate that it ended this way, and you know how I feel. Hell, if you weren't my brother-in-law, and you always will be, I'd stick up for you myself. I'll try to steer her down a different path and see what happens, but like I said, what you talked about must have hurt her because she told me she was going to move on with her life. That's good to hear, Anne, and I appreciate your support. You know I've always loved her, but I could never get over what she did. Yeah, she knows that. She's been hung up on that scumbag she's had since you two met, but I think she realizes now that he cost her everything. I just nodded, and we chatted some more before she left to go back to work. I picked up the bill and headed up the hill to drive to Tennessee. Sandra was gardening when I arrived at her place on Thursday, and the dogs, as expected, heralded my arrival. It was damn hot that day, and she was dressed accordingly. Very short cropped jeans and a t-shirt with a tight neckline, nothing else. I tried hard not to glue my gaze to her very erect nipples showing through the thin fabric. She ran out to meet me and gave me a hug before we went inside to make a cold drink. Now my little one's like you. She pointed to the panting dogs lying on the kitchen floor. I wish they'd tell me that themselves, I joked. She made herself an iced tea and handed me an iced beer. A few minutes later, we were discussing the details of selling her car collection. A friend of mine from Sevierville had offered to auction them off for an 8% commission with a guarantee of $65,000 per lot. I decided that was a good deal for the condition they were in, and Sandra agreed. Once we were done, we settled on the veranda, enjoying drinks in the midday heat. Want to go for a swim? She asked with a smirk. She asked with a smirk on her face. Daddy dug it wider and deeper a couple years ago, and it's a pretty good hole, especially on a day like this. I didn't bring my swim trunks with me. You don't need them, there's no one around. Well, I'm not shy around women and I know I have no flaws, so I agreed, trying to wipe the huge grin off my face. We grabbed a couple beers and towels to head to the backside of the property, and when we got there, Sandra just pulled off her shorts and top, threw them on a branch and jumped into the pond fed by the creek. I'd be lying if I said I was a little hesitant, but I just shrugged and started ripping off my clothes. When I was as naked as Sandra was, I threw myself into the pond and waded into the water up to my shoulders. Sandra was standing next to me with a wide, happy smile on her face. I used to come here as a little girl when my grandmother lived here. We'd both jump in the water and take a dip on hot days like this. Great memories. There were a couple boys who lived along the road who spied on us girls until my grandmother asked her dog to stand guard. The closest I ever got to swimming as a child was when we would come to Jonathan Creek and jump in the water, but the water there was cold. Remembering this made me laugh. I dove under the water and swam for a bit before surfacing next to Sandra. When I surfaced, our faces were only a few centimeters apart, and I looked directly into her moist blue eyes. The next moment, her arms wrapped around my neck. I like you, Josh Sutton. I really do. She looked up at me and I told her, Miss Sandra, I've had a schoolboy crush on you since the first time we met. Good, you can take me out to eat tonight instead of having dinner at a restaurant. With those words, we swam some more and got out of the pond. After drying off and getting home, we headed over to Cosby's itself. I have to say that there aren't many restaurants in Cosby, but there is a magnolia tree and they make great brisket, so that's where we headed. We got a nice table out of the way, and I had the best dining experience I've had in a long time, all thanks to the company of the woman I was with. I don't think there was anything we didn't talk about at some point, and by the time we got out of there, it was getting dark and I still had to drive her home. We pulled into the gravel parking lot around 9:30, and I walked her to the door and kissed her while Samson and Delilah looked on. You don't have to go to Sevierville tonight, Josh. I've got the guest room ready. You can have a hearty breakfast and hit the road as early as you'd like. Her smile convinced me, and after calling the hotel and canceling my reservation for tonight, I spent the night in her guest room instead of my own bed. And in the morning she sent me off to work, feeding me an old-fashioned country breakfast. This time I made a date for Saturday afternoon and dinner in Gatlinburg. We spent Saturday night at a bed and breakfast in the village of Gatlinburg. Sandra was very different from the previous women in my life, especially June and of course Terry. She was sensual. I don't know where she learned that, but I realized even then that her ex-husband was a damn fool. From that point on, we began courting each other and continued our semi-remote meetings, staying at her house more often and occasionally traveling to Waynesville in Sandra's car. I met her father, who regarded me with some wariness until Sandra spoke to him privately. I don't know what she said to him, but from then on, he was always friendly to me. One bright and sunny Saturday morning, wetting a dry fly in the ripples of Big Creek, I made the decision to take the next big step in my life. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, the line on my fly rod pulled hard and the jerk of the reel chased the line until I caught it with my thumb and the fight was on. After a few minutes of enjoying the game, I pulled out a 1.5-pound trout. This was a good sign for me and confirmation that life was going well. Later in the afternoon, Sandra and I drove back to Waynesville and decided to spend the evening in Asheville. As it turned out, we ended up at the dance hall on Patton, where I so often spent evenings with my old friendly company. I didn't have much time with my old group of friends, including Terry. After I got into a serious relationship with Sandra, it had to be cut short for a while. Well, I should have known that I would run into a lot of people I knew. Terry was there with her current chosen one, as well as a few people from the old gang, including a few from the hospital where Terry and June still worked. I could see her from across the floor. June was with some guy I didn't know and looked happy. June had done her best to move on with her life and even apologized to me for ruining our marriage. My parents still treated her like a daughter, and frankly, it didn't bother me one bit. Of course, she didn't know I was in a serious relationship and she first saw me with Sandra. Sandra and I had danced a few numbers and were socializing at the bar when June came up behind me. "Hello, stranger," she said to me as I turned around. "Hey, June, you look good." I didn't notice her companion nearby. "So do you, Josh. Your mom and dad said you're doing well and spending a lot of time working in Tennessee. I'm happy for you, I really am." I introduced her to Sandra, and there was a hint of sadness in her eyes, but she knew how to hide it from others, at least it seemed that way to me. We hugged lightly and she went back to the group she was with. No, the next moment I felt myself getting hit in the head. Sandra shrieked, "No, Bill, you can't do that." But it was too late. He swung at me again and I brought him down with a right punch. Sandra cried out and then, to my surprise, June came running up and bent down to help the man lying on the floor. "Jesus, Josh, what the hell?" June asked. I looked at her and tried to grasp the connection before I realized it was the guy she was with earlier. "Honey, this is my ex-husband Bill," Sandra whispered to me. "June, he attacked Josh, not the other way around," she told her. By then, the bouncers had picked him up off the floor and carried him out the door, and June had excused herself to the restroom. Sandra and I returned to the bar where 2 fresh drinks, courtesy of the establishment, were waiting for us. "Now you know why I had a restraining order. He's crazy," she said. I just agreed and tried to wave the thought away. This episode marred our evening somewhat, and as we were about to leave, June approached us again. Sandra explained who he was and what he did, and June almost cried. Since he was her traveling companion, amazing coincidence or not, she was without a car, and the 2 of us agreed to drive her to Sister Anne's house. As we were pulling out, June stopped to wave goodbye to someone, and Sandra and I left the house and headed for the parking lot. June was just coming out behind us and catching up to us when I saw a white flash and a loud pop in front of me. I dropped to the ground and immediately returned fire. Bill Dresser was curled up on the spot. I began groping myself to determine if I had been shot. I felt no pain or impact, so I assumed I had been hit by a drunken brat. At this point, Sandra screamed in panic, "Oh my God!" I turned around. June was lying on her back. Home security was already rushing to the scene when I approached her and realized she was still alive and semi-conscious. Some people compare the experience to freezing time, but it was more like watching a movie and being somewhat detached from what was happening. The woman asked me to step aside and started administering first aid, and after a few moments, which seemed like moments to me but were actually a few minutes, an EMT arrived and took over. They took her to Mission Hospital, and we followed them. At some point, it occurred to me to call Anne to let her know what had happened and ask her to come to the hospital. When she arrived, June had already been moved to the operating room, and we sat in the operating room waiting for someone to tell us something. Eventually, a nurse came out to us and told us that June was still in surgery and that it would be another long night before they knew exactly what her condition was. At this point, her condition was critical. Sandra and Anne were left alone while I went to get food, and when I returned, they were both waiting by the window holding hands. Anne was in a terrible state, but after we crammed some food into her, we all sat down next to each other and waited for the operation to begin. 3 hours had passed when the doctor came out to share the prognosis. She is now in the ICU and we think she will live. The severity of her injuries will only be known after she comes out of the induced coma we put her in, so her body can recover. The bullet shattered on impact, but some of it hit the medial temporal lobe, which may affect some types of memory. We won't find out until later, but from what we discovered during surgery, her motor functions shouldn't be affected. Obviously, we'll know more over the next few days. We were given a few minutes of quiet time with her, and Sandra and I spent the evening comforting my distraught sister-in-law. The next morning, the doctors gave Anne and her parents the latest news. They were mostly the same as the night before. June had remained in an induced coma for 4 days. When she was awakened, Anne and her parents were there, and the first person she asked to see was me. Before I went to the hospital to see her, Anne brought me up to speed. She has good speech and hearing, although her right eye is still a little clouded, but the doctors think that will pass with time. The thing is, she's lost some of her memory. She has no idea how or where she was shot or by whom. You need to prepare for that, Josh. She thinks she's still married to you. It's like nothing has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, seriously, she thinks you two were getting ready to have a bunch of kids, and because of this, you're going to have to put it off for a couple months. At that moment, I didn't know what to think and even considered going to the hospital, but Sandra in her wisdom didn't want to hear anything. She went there with me, but stayed downstairs in the hall while I went up to the ward. June looked terrible, but she was conscious and resting. Her parents had just come downstairs and Anne was sitting on the other side of her. She wasn't wasting any time. Josh, where are my wedding rings? I know I wore them yesterday morning or whenever before all this happened. Anne only looked at me sadly, as if hoping I could answer as if I was still her husband. I really didn't know what to do. The problem was that I was in love, and the engagement ring was sitting in my bedroom dresser, waiting for an opportunity that I thought would present itself a few days ago. June, do you know what date or year it is? I asked her sincerely in a soft voice. Well, it must be July 2012, but my doctor tells me it's not, and I just don't understand it. I shifted my gaze to Anne and asked, You haven't told her? She just shook her head with tears in her eyes. June, don't worry about your rings right now. It's more important that you get better and hopefully get some of your memory back. I tried to smile, but my concerned expression got in the way. June wanted to take my hand when I sat down, and I didn't object, though my mind was spinning, trying to realize the implications of all of this. We talked about a lot of things, both family and recovering before her eyes, but I avoided the elephant in the room. Later in the waiting area, I talked to Anne and June's doctor about the prognosis for her memory. She seemed to be fine with most of her memories. She recognized family and friends, but had difficulty connecting dates and events together. Many things she had no memory of, including her infidelity and our divorce. Does she have a chance of recovering those memories? I asked the doctor. That's always hard to predict. Maybe some person or place will trigger the memories. We'll have to see. I can't tell you how to proceed, Mr. Sutton. All I can say is it's 50 one way or the other. She could stay where she is, or she could take it all back. We just don't know. I thanked the doctor and gave Anne a big hug. I also told her that I had planned to propose to Sandra the night June was shot, but didn't have time. She replied that Sandra had already told her that. I guess I'm not as good at keeping secrets as I thought I was. In fact, I already knew what I was going to do. All that was left was to go downstairs and do it. The twin Can-Am Spider F3S raced down the gravel surface of the old Hutch Road with the wind in their hair and a mile of dust behind them. As we approached the bridge over Big Creek, we stopped for a rest stop to take a break and wet the fishing line for a chance to catch a big brown trout. Suffice it to say, it's still roaming the same waters today. A lot has happened in the past year since June was shot, and Bill Dresser rested in peace after our fight in Asheville. I sold my home in Waynesville, and the company let me work out of the regional office in Cosby, my choice. I chose an extra room in Sandra's farmhouse since most of my work was during the daytime. I still have to work nights, but it is manageable. Sandra works as a midwife almost full-time, but last May we took 2 weeks off to enjoy the sunshine together in Key West. Joshua and Sandra Sutton returned refreshed, tanned, and ready to start a new life together. A year ago, as I rode the elevator down to Sandra in the hospital lobby, I thought back to my failed marriage and what might lie ahead. And the decision was very simple. I had already moved on. Why should I throw away the happiness I had now for someone who was still a cheater, a cuckold, and a whore, even if she didn't remember any of it? Hell, I know drunks who remember nothing the next day and remain the same person they were the day before. Anne made it easy for me. She sat June down and explained life to her. She even enlisted my old nemesis Charlie to see if he could clear her memory, but to no avail. Eventually, June accepted the truth, even though she didn't remember it, and I think it caused her great remorse. She went through a period of depression, and then my angel did something amazing. One weekday afternoon, Sandra drove herself to Waynesville. I was on a business trip and knew nothing about it. She told me about it a couple months later. Josh, I felt I had to do something. I want you to imagine how you would feel if the same thing happened to you and the woman you love ran off out of the blue, without explanation, to marry some other guy. I'm not sure exactly how I would have reacted, but I'm sure it's about the same way June did. She knew that her husband, or the man who used to be her husband, was in love with a woman and was going to marry her. It must have devastated her, and I can understand that. She knew it too. She knows the truth and admits that it was her act that plunged her into these depths of depression. I gave her a choice. Either wallow in self-pity and spend the rest of her life in misery because of what she had done, or move on with her life as she had before the shooting. The choice was hers. The benefit of moving forward was her friendship with me, with us, with both of us. And that's exactly what she did. By the time we cast our rods into the waters of Big Creek, 2 more Can-Am spiders were parked next to us, and June and her significant other, with whom she'd been living for the past 6 months, dismounted and joined us, trying to convince the big recluse to try again. Somehow, after going through all the struggles and turmoil of betrayal, divorce, trying to move on with our lives and finding new love, June and I managed to come out of it all as friends. My parents still love her and often invite her to visit with her new lover. They have come to terms with reality and love Sandra as much as June does. As for me, life is good right now, and the only problem looming on my horizon is how to fit the addition to our family in the backseat of the new 2-seater Can-Am. Sandra told me last night that I'm going to be a dad. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next videos.